KCBS, in partnership with UCSF Health, presents As Prescribed, a weekly conversation with leading medical experts from UCSF Medical Center and UCSF Benioff Children's Hospitals.
Hello and welcome to As Prescribed. I'm Alice Wertz. Repeated concussions can lead to long-term complications, including neurodegenerative disorders like CTE, as well as long-term like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. But is there a way that we can prevent long-term impacts from concussions, as well as help athletes return to play safely? Our guest today is Dr. Wade Smith, professor of neurology at UCSF and a specialist in neurocritical care. He's also director of the Neurovascular Service at UCSF and co-founder of the Neurocritical Care Society. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Smith.
Well, thank you, Alice, for having me.
So please share with us, what exactly is a concussion and what are some of the symptoms and why is it bad?
Many people, I think, on this that are listening to this know what a concussion is because they probably had one. And basically, it's a change in the brain function that's caused by a sudden strike to the head. A lot of the symptoms are headache, dizziness, in some cases, loss of consciousness. And then probably the hallmark is amnesia, where you just can't really remember what happened. So it's a clinical diagnosis. I, as a neurologist, by talking to the patient or hearing the story, can make the diagnosis. And so it's based upon subjective symptoms, so how the patient feels. That's what they report to us. But it's also objective symptoms like were they seen to fall to the ground and be unconscious, or afterwards when they stood up, were they unstable in their gait? Those are objective signs that people can see.
What are some of the potential impacts, especially for athletes when they have repeated concussions? Why is that pattern so particularly dangerous?
Well, there are rare cases where somebody who's had one concussion who gets put back into a risk, perhaps, particularly in sports, where they get a second concussion within minutes or hours, can actually be fatal. That's called second impact syndrome. It's quite rare, but obviously very scary and awful as an outcome. The much more common side effect, we think of it, is that if you get another head strike while your brain is vulnerable to injury, we believe that makes the brain effectively change over time. So that's what most of the sports protocols that are put in for organized sports to amateur sports in high school, middle school, for example, where they take you out of play once you've had a concussion and wait for you to get better before they return you to play.
So technology, you've developed one of your own. Explain what it is and how it can help to address concussions.
So the background, before I tell you that exactly, is that the way that if I were a sports medicine doctor or the primary care doctor taking care of the patient, what I would do is ask them, how do you feel? Do you have any more headache, dizziness, trouble remembering things, foggy thinking, etc.? Have them walk, look at their strength, make sure their neurologic exam is normal. If they follow through on that just fine, then what you typically do is you ask the subject to go back to some form of aerobic or beyond aerobic activity, some sort of impact type of activity. For some, it's running. Others, it could be entering slightly back into the sport itself. And then you ask them, how do you feel? And if they feel fine, then you progressively increase their activity to the point of contact. That is the standard protocol that's used by organized sports and amateur sports, as well as somebody who fell off their skateboard, for example, and has had a concussion. That's what we would advise them. Note, in all of this, what we're doing is asking the person, how do you feel? Do you feel okay? And that is, as we call, a subjective term because they interpret that how they want. Let's say that student athlete is star on the football team, and they're going to be playing their major game coming up. And in practice, they had a concussion. It puts the individual athlete at conflict to say, no, I don't have a headache. I feel fine. I can remember just okay. I want to go back and play. And then based upon that, they're cleared to return. So there are some conflicts effectively that return athletes perhaps too early. And then you can imagine in organized sports where there's money involved that there's incentive to have a person return sooner. So what's missing before the paper we wrote is that there's no objective measure. There isn't something you can do a brain MRI, but that looks normal in these patients. All kinds of different lab tests. You can do one lab test now in the first 12 hours to confirm that they had a concussion, but you already know they had a concussion. The question is your brain still abnormal? And can we use that as a measure? And that's what this device does.
So tell us about it. What is it? A architecture that goes into a helmet, or how would you describe it for our listeners?
Well, you could look at the device that we used in the trial that we presented is this is an example of it. It's basically just a hairband, goes over the head this way. That it has a sensor in it, which is a very sensitive accelerometer. That's something that measures force. And what we're measuring is the heartbeat impact upon the head and how much the head vibrates afterwards. That vibration tells us about the state of the brain. And we find that in people who have had a concussion, that their brain is wiggling or resonating at a higher frequency. This isn't something that the person feels, but we can detect it. And based upon that frequency that it's vibrating at, we can follow that and see it come back to normal. So we think that this process is telling us something about the physiology of the brain and when it's come back. And in the paper that we wrote, in athletes, this is an Australian rules football, which is a particularly high concussion rate. Athletes, their brains did not return back to a normal head pulse signal for 14 days after they felt normal. And that suggests that people could be put into play earlier where it may be causing more harm. And then the second thing that was really remarkable is if you look at the subjects who returned back to play, even when they reported feeling completely normal, this biometric, this headset said their brains were getting abnormal again. So this is a way to potentially counsel people that they return too soon, and also to add some science to the field of concussion recovery that heretofore hasn't been possible.
What's your hope with this device that you've developed?
Well, John Madden, who's graciously donated money for this research at UCSF, the late John Madden, was passionate about concussion. What he said was, you've got to get to the athletes while their mothers are still in control. And by that, he meant that there's going to be hard to change minds that are deeply entrenched in the economics and other aspects of this at, say, later periods of life. But if you get in the middle schools and the high schools and you do this type of testing on potential athletes, people who are concussion prone might be able to be steered into activities which are less injurious to the brain, but equally athletic. And so maybe what we can do is help prevent head injury, the consequences of it in people who are vulnerable. We don't know that yet, but it certainly makes a lot of sense. And for me as a parent to know that my child on the app still has a red dot next to her saying that her brain is still abnormal, she's not going to go back to play. And from that, I hopefully could prevent brain injury in my kid and prevent all of the downstream consequences that could lead to neurodegenerative illnesses and other troubles.
So would you envision this technology as being in the clinical practice or on the fields of sports teams?
We think we've shown some work with Dr. Halabi, who was the primary author of this study, has shown that athletes can don the device. They can put it on themselves over the course of a month quite well. And so our intent is to come up with a monitoring technology where a physician can order it and say, Susie was playing volleyball, she had a head strike, I think she had a concussion. I'd like her monitored. And then when the monitoring gets back to normal, then she can have the follow-up visit with the doc. So the doc looks at the data, examines her, and then makes a medical decision to return to play. That is a nice process. It involves the physician's consideration of all of the details in addition to this piece of data. So this, we think, will aid in that decision-making.
Excellent. Excellent work you're doing there, Dr. Smith. Thank you so much for joining us today on As Prescribed.
Thank you.
Our guest today has been Dr. Wade Smith. He's professor of neurology at UCSF and a specialist in neurocritical care. He's director of neurovascular service at UCSF Health and co-founder of the Neurocritical Care Society. Thank you for tuning in to As Prescribed. I'm Alice Wertz.
As Prescribed, every Thursday at 1:30, right here on the Bay Area's news station, All News 106.9 and AM 740 KCBS, and streaming on the Odyssey app. The proceeding was sponsored by UCSF.